Thank you. We'll call the hearing to order, and let me say this is an incredibly well-mannered group. 10:30 hit, everyone sat down and was quiet without even saying anything. I appreciate that. We are here this morning to hear the posture hearing on the Army's budget request for FY21 based on the President's budget request. And we are joined by Secretary McCarthy and General McConnville, the Army Chief of Staff, to hear their testimony and thoughts on those issues. There are obviously no end of challenges within meeting our national security needs within the Army. I would like to focus on three in my opening statement. I have a longer, more detailed, more dry statement for the public record. But first of all, the big thing is the Army Futures Command. This was a huge move, and I know this was also part of the blank slate review and the night court exercise that the Army underwent when Secretary Esper was the Secretary of the Army and has continued since. What has that told us? I know it's very early in the process, but there was a very laudable goal to try to figure out, okay, things have changed, technology is incredibly important, there's a lot going on. What systems are we spending money on that we shouldn't be? Where do we need to reinvest? Learning more about how that process is moving forward is incredibly important. Second, on personnel matters, this year, I believe the Army did meet its recruitment goals. I know the previous year they had not. Would love to get an update on how recruitment is going. We have obviously heard, considerable concerns about the number of age-eligible people in the U.S. who are actually physically qualified to even serve in the military. Is that becoming a problem in terms of getting the personnel that you need to get where you're at? And then the readiness issue. We all know that as a result, in part, of our commitment to Afghanistan and Iraq for better part of a decade or more, we had to shift goals, and that hurt overall readiness. Then, of course, we had the Budget Control Act and 6-7 years worth of budget shutdowns and threatened shutdowns and continuing resolutions and all manner of insanity that made it difficult to budget. I'm going to point out again, it's good this year we have a budget deal. Hopefully we'll be able to get it done closer to October 1st, but there has been some consistency put into it. How has that affected our ability to meet our readiness goals? And then overarching all of this for all of the services and throughout the national defense is we have the National Defense Strategy, which is an excellent document, I think, that lays out the challenges we face. We all know Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, transnational terrorist groups. Broadly speaking, that is the threat environment we face. How do we meet that? One of my continuing concerns here is if you take each one of those and say, okay, what do we have to do to make sure that we are completely protected? And you try to do all five, there isn't enough money or personnel in the world that I'm aware of to meet all of those goals. So how do we prioritize? How do we, as the military loves to say, manage risk intelligently? And I think the Secretary Esper and I have talked about this a lot, and he shares the frustration. People coming in here constantly saying, here's the threat, we're completely and totally unprepared, we have to do all this stuff in order to meet it, but by the way, we don't have the resources to meet it. That is not a very productive exercise to my mind. Once we know what the resources are, I think we can put together a realistic strategy to meet those threats instead of sort of being in panic mode all the time. Lastly, before I yield to the ranking member, I want to recognize that we started late this morning because you had to be at a funeral for Antonio Rodriguez, a member of the 7th Group who was killed in Afghanistan. And while we have significantly reduced our presence in our op tempo in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is not done, and we still have men and women from our country who are putting their lives on the line every day. This is a stark reminder of that. We need to remember them, honor their sacrifice, and do everything we can to support our troops and our families. With that, I will yield to Mr. Lambert. Ranking Member Mr. Thornberry is ill this morning, so Mr. Lambert is sitting in. I yield to Mr. Lambert for any comments he may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for those last remarks in particular. Well said. Secretary McCarthy and General McConnville, on behalf of Ranking Member Thornberry and my colleagues and myself, thank you for your dedicated service to this nation, your support to every soldier and each of their families, and for being here today to provide testimony on the Army's fiscal year 2021 budget request. Today, we expect to have a good discussion over how the Army is operationalizing the National Defense Strategy with this budget request, and to include how the Army is manning, training, and equipping the force to address both near and long-term challenges posed by great power competitors like China and Russia. In this context, and with flat budgets likely to be the norm, I appreciate the Army's reform efforts to find savings within its current budget in order to increase investment for its 6 modernization priorities. The fiscal year 2021 budget request includes $12.7 billion for research and development and $24.1 billion for procurement. General McConville has stated that, quote, while we have managed to sustain the readiness gains the Army has achieved in fiscal years 18 to 20 and further invest in our 6 modernization priorities, our progress is at risk in future years if we don't have real growth of 3 to 5% in our budgets going forward, unquote. Clearly, making hard choices will continue to be required, and my hope is that we can work together to continue striking the right balance to fund both current readiness and needed modernization. From what I understand, the Department of Defense has made progress in maturing the capstone concept for joint operations, and that the Army has been designated as the lead service to develop the supporting logistics concept. Providing logistics support in a contested environment is no small challenge. My hope is that we will begin to see some serious effort to reduce the demand for operational energy. I am most concerned about reducing our reliance on fossil fuels for both the new systems we plan to buy and for the legacy systems we will continue to operate for decades. Approximately 75% of the convoys and forces performed in Iraq and Afghanistan were to transport fuel and water. This is a serious operational vulnerability. The current and projected readiness of the surge sea lift fleet is critical to our ability to protect the Army. Although this is clearly a Navy requirement, it is also inextricably linked to the Army's relevance, and I hope we find a path to recapitalize this essential capability. I also look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the Army's way ahead with the sustainable readiness model. This critical concept has helped the Army smooth out readiness through many units' experience after deployments. Maintaining the higher operations tempo has come at the cost for the 1 million men and women serving in all 3 components of the Army, active, guard, and reserve. I am encouraged by this improvement and hope that with some minor adjustments, this concept will continue to serve the Army well. Finally, I look forward to hearing an update on the Army's progress in implementing the military housing privatization initiative reform that we passed in a very bipartisan way in the fiscal year 2020 NDAA. We know that some of the provisions will take some time to implement, but this committee is fully committed to keeping faith with our military families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Before hearing from our witnesses, one programming note. We are going from last to first. The last shall be first. So we are doing reverse order on our questioning today. So for your preparation, we'll start with the most junior member and work our way back up once we get to questions. But with that, I will yield to Mr. McCarthy for his opening statement.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and Mr. Lamborn, excuse me. Distinguished members of this committee, thank you for your continued support to the Army and our people. In 2018, the National Defense Strategy outlined the current and future threat picture, drastically changing the Army's focus. The strategy outlined great power competition, specifically Russia and China, who are rapidly investing to modernize their formations. In order to achieve national objectives laid out in the defense strategy, including deterrence, the Army, with the support of Congress, developed 3 distinct priorities of readiness, modernization, and reform, and aligned our budget against the same. 2.5 years into our modernization efforts, we are here to continue what we collectively started. This budget request builds upon the funding authorities that Congress provided over the past 2 years. Together, we are creating irreversible momentum towards a ready, modernized, multi-domain Army, capable to meet future demands highlighted in the NDS. Our FY21 budget request is $178 billion. 60% of that top line is invested in our people and towards operations and maintenance, with the remainder of our available budget aligned towards our modernization priorities. Despite a fixed top line and flat budget, demand for Army forces continues to rise. The Army currently fulfills 60% of the overall combatant commander's demands, with no projected decrease in COCOM demand. Demand, paired with the need to bring new systems online, will require us to grow the budget 3 to 5% real growth in the out years. Readiness remains the Army's #1 priority. We remain ready today, capable of dynamic force projection. Take, for example, this year on New Year's Eve, we pushed a brigade-size element on a no-notice, cold start, emergency deployment. Within hours, soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division went from holidays parties to wheels up on a C-17. Within a day, soldiers were operating in the Middle East. Nearly half of our brigade combat teams are at the highest levels of readiness, pulling us from a readiness trough to a readiness peak over the last 3 years. On modernization, we are rapidly developing new technologies across 6 modernization priorities and 31 signature systems, all geared towards meeting the demand of the future battlefields. The creation of Army Futures Command has allowed us to combine the stakeholders together and rapidly increase the speed of the modernization process. We are seeing real results. Prototypes that began in FY18 and 19 are maturing, with real capability landing in FY21 and FY22. In this fiscal year, we will increase soldier touchpoints, test shots, capability demonstrations, and the fielding of our formations. The Army is investing $800 million across the next 5 years defense plan towards cloud computing, which is central to our modernization effort. Long-range fires, including extended-range cannon artillery, precision strike missile, and hypersonic missiles, are flying further and hitting their targets, increasing our reach and lethality, essential in deterrence in the joint fight. We have invested $1.3 billion towards these efforts, and continued funding will allow the Army to field a road mobile battery in FY23 for hypersonic missiles. New aircraft in our future vertical lift portfolio are flying hundreds of test hours as we fly before we buy. We have seen great advances in our soldier lethality portfolio for individual kit with the integrated visual augmentation system that links multiple sensors to multiple shooters and multiple command and control nodes, ultimately increasing lethality and survivability of our men and women. The demand for Army forces, paired against a flat budget, has forced tough fiscal decisions. In-depth program reviews will continue in FY21, with a total target of an additional $9.1 billion in programs that will be delayed, reduced, or eliminated. The Army will continue to show fiscal responsibility with taxpayer dollars. We view every dollar as we do with ammunition. Each bullet matters and is aimed at a target. With Congress's steadfast support, we are here to finish what we collectively started. I'd like to share the floor with my teammate, General McConville, and I look forward to your questions.
Chairman Smith, Mr. Lambourn, distinguished members of the committee, I also want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for the support you all continue to give to our Army and our people, our soldiers, our families, our civilians, and our soldiers for life, our retirees and veterans. As of this morning, the Army has over 190,000 soldiers deployed to 140 countries all around the world. Those soldiers form the leading edge of an Army that stands ready to fight and win whenever and wherever it's called. We are currently demonstrating Army readiness with our Defender 20 exercise in Europe, the largest of its kind in 25 years, and we'll do the same in the Pacific in the fall on a smaller scale. Both exercises will further strengthen not only our readiness to deploy U.S. Army forces, but they will also increase our ability to fight alongside our allies and partners and to deter those nations or groups who wish America harm. Going forward, we'll sustain the tactical readiness of our units, while at the same time ensuring we are strategically ready to mobilize, deploy, and sustain our combat forces in a way that supports how we will fight in the future. To ensure the Army will be ready and can win in the future, we must also modernize, as the Secretary and I have discussed with many of you. The National Defense Strategy has focused us on great power competition, but great power competition does not have to mean great power conflict. A ready, modern, and multi-domain Army provides the nation's strategic leaders with the flexible options to compete below the threshold of armed conflict while maximizing deterrence. With timely, adequate, predictable, and sustained funding, we will deliver an Army that will never be outranged, outgunned, or overmatched. But get to the Army that we need in the future requires transformational change, not incremental improvements. Our FY21 budget requests support that supports transformational change. It aligns our resources with the National Defense Strategy and our Army priorities. It also balances the demands for readiness now and allows us to invest in the future. Our budget request maintains 58 brigade combat teams, 23 aviation brigades, and 6 security force assistant brigades across the regular Army, the Army National Guard, and the Army Reserves. It enables 24 combat training center rotations, including 4 for the Army National Guard. It funds strategic readiness, including dynamic force employments to Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and the maintenance of key position stocks and ammunition. It provides modest end strength growth to meet expanding operation requirements and promotes interoperability with allies and partners through combined exercises with countries around the world. In terms of modernization, our request supports the continuing development of the Army's multi-domain operations concept, which will inform our contributions to the emerging joint warfighting concept. Our request funds multi-domain task forces in Europe and the Pacific to increase Army's capability in both competition and conflict. And our budget request supports critical steps in research and development that will allow us to deliver key systems across our 6 modernization priorities. Our budget request also funds key quality of life improvements like housing and child care to take care of our people. Finally, our budget helps us win the war for talent by moving us from an industrial age personnel management system to a 21st century information age talent management system with the continuing implementation of the integrated personnel and pay system and initiatives like the talent-based branching, the Army talent alignment process, and the Battalion Command and Assessment Program. Thank you for your time and for your support to our Army. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you both. I don't have any initial questions. I've had the opportunity to meet with both you gentlemen and speak to you a number of times, so I will begin by yielding to Ms. Trahan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary McCarthy and General McConville. The Army's Futures Command is focused on delivering capabilities aligned to the Army's 6 modernization priorities to the battlefield in the next 5 to 10 years. But the Army's laboratories, alternatively, should be focused on longer-term groundbreaking science and technology development for the next generation of warfighting, say, in the next 20 to 30 years. The Army's great laboratories, including Natick Soldier Systems Center in Massachusetts, now align under AFC, and they're doing excellent work supporting the Army's priorities today through 2028. But how will Futures Command champion and prioritize the necessary long-term scientific and technology research required for our next generation Army of the future?
Ma'am, when we did the merger for Army Futures Command, a lot of it was we needed to take a look at how the investments were performing across our lab network, both internally and externally. So General Murray has been in the process of a review of the entire S&T portfolio so that we could take a look at where was the best engineering and science talent worldwide that can support our objectives. Much of that we realized was that we were spreading the money around and didn't have strategic relationships that aligned with the investment portfolios, to your point, from a near-term research to the much more disruptive 2020 changing a technology and would ultimately change the way we fight. So he's been in that process. We've made some adjustments, and we'll probably make another adjustment by the FY22 when we drop that budget next year.
Thank you. I'm just going to switch gears because there's been a myriad of factors that surged from the escalation created by the Soleimani attack. And I'm worried about our ability to properly diagnose those affected with the invisible wounds of war, especially after the Iranian ballistic missile attack on Al-Assad Air Base on January 8th. And the latest update shows that as many as 110 U.S. service members suffered from traumatic brain injury, or TBI, as a result of the blast. And while the president categorized some of these injuries as headaches, we know that it's much more than that. They're much more serious than headaches, as these conditions are often linked to suicide, PTSD, et cetera. So I'm wondering if there's a reliable way to determine who has a brain injury and who does not in theater. And I'm also wondering if the department is broadly leveraging commercial available technologies that quantitatively measure and record blast over pressure exposures, because I understand that technologies have been fielded successfully in combat environments as early as 2011 through DARPA.
Yes, Congressman, over the last 19 years, we've seen a lot of blasts with our soldiers, and I think the Army and really the military has been on the cutting edge of concussion research, because we are very concerned with traumatic brain injury, which also leads to post-traumatic stress and some of the terrible things that go along with that. But we do have the capability, and quite frankly, we've actually changed the culture, where when someone's near a blast, you're going to get checked out. It's no longer take a punch in the head and just kind of get after it and get back in the fight. What we've learned is if you get exposed to a blast, you have a good opportunity to recover if you get the proper medical support. And so what we do now, anyone that's involved in any type of blast, whether it's an IED or, in this case, those are very large theater ballistic missiles that hit into Iraq with 1,000-pound capabilities, is we have diagnostic cases, or we have diagnostic systems, MACE-2, which allows us to test the soldiers at the point of contact, and those that need more testing, we start to move them back through our medical system, and that's what we've done with these soldiers. Many were returned back to duty, about 70, about 37, I think is the number, actually came back here, and we will make sure that they get the best care that this country has to offer, and there's some terrific scientists that have done some incredible work in that area, and we want to make sure they get to that level.
You bet. And if there's anything that Congress can undertake to ensure that those technologies are more rapidly fielded,
Sure.
I would love to work with you on that. So
Okay.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have two questions, and then later we'll go to Mr. Waltz and proceed accordingly. But first, let me ask this. General McConville, in the fiscal year 19 NDAA, the Army was directed by Congress to procure 4 batteries of an interim indirect fire protection capability against mortars and artillery. After having deliberated for years over what form this capability should take. Now, the Army has procured 2 Iron Dome systems as a result of this NDAA requirement. So it seems that while the Army continues to evaluate this enduring indirect fire protection capability, the Iron Dome capability appears to be a battle-proven system and a known quantity, and is something we have on hand. Could you please update this committee on the status of the Army's plans for indirect fire protection capability, which is very justified and is a threat that we face? And does the Army have plans to procure an additional 2 batteries of Iron Dome, and how does Iron Dome fit into these plans?
Yes, Congressman, and first of all, very concerned about the indirect fire and really the threat to our soldiers from any type of system, whether it's unmanned aerial systems, it's theater ballistic missiles, and where the Army's going is right now, as you've said, we went ahead and have purchased 2 Iron Dome batteries. They are standalone static batteries to provide a certain capability. They are combat proven. But where the Army's going to is a layered defense for air and missile defense. We see that in the future as something we're very concerned about. We want to be able to tie every sensor to shooter. The way we see the future is multiple radars will be tied into a integrated battle command system, which will be able to apply the appropriate shooter or response to whatever that threat is. And that response could be directed energy, which we're working on right now. It could be high-powered microwave, which we're working on right now. It could be some type of gun system, which we have the capability to do right now. It could be a missile system at the lower and higher level, which you want to do. But what we don't want to do is be in a position where we're shooting Patriot missile systems or even larger missile systems at small unmanned aerial systems where the value analysis doesn't work out. So we're not, as we talk to Iron Dome and they bring it on board, we're going to get a chance to get our soldiers on board. We are broadcasting the type of system that we want and what we need in the future, and we want them to compete along with other U.S. companies that want to compete for this long-term capability.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to seeing how that continues to fit into the evolving plans. I think it's a very proven and critical defense. And secondly and lastly, for both of you, I want to ask about the current strength of our Patriot and THAAD forces. A recent Army study increased the THAAD battery requirement from 7 batteries to 8. But this 8th battery was not in the Army's fiscal 21 year budget request and can only be found in the Missile Defense Agency's unfunded priority list. I know we're investing in a new Patriot radar and other modernization initiatives. However, THAAD and Patriot batteries are among the most deployed units in the military, and I'm concerned that we might be spread too thin. And this was brought to the attention of the American public when our soldiers in Iraq were targeted by a ballistic missile attack recently. Do you feel the Army has the missile defense force structure to meet current global requirements?
I think the Army has what it needs because it has what it has right now, and if we innovatively employ those systems, we have what we need. We are taking a look, again, getting to how we work in the future. When we take a look at places like the Middle East, how do we work with partners that have Patriot capability that can defend themselves? And what we're looking at in some cases when it comes to air and missile defense is advising and assisting our partners so they use their capability to defend their bases and their critical infrastructure, and that we can use our systems to take care of our soldiers and our bases is where we want to go in that. Now, the secret, though, at least from, not the secret, but the end state for us is really tying in multiple sensors with multiple shooters, and THAAD and Patriot are part of that equation.
So you do feel you need that 8th battery, even though it's not in your request?
Sir, the MDA is the one that developed the THAAD system, and they fund that through the Missile Defense Agency. We work that in concert with the Missile Defense Agency. With respect also to the Patriot systems, we're working with the manufacturer to increase capacity and with our allies and partners to increase the sales, and to General McConville's point about an advise and assist capability so that we can bring our batteries home and have our allies do more of their share.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gold.
Thank you. Secretary McCarthy, earlier this month in speaking about the Close Combat Lethality Task Force, Secretary Esper mentioned that, and this is a quote, "What we're going to do probably is transition it to the Army because something like that needs a strong foundation, a backbone upon which its ideas can then filter out." Do you support this organizational restructuring?
Absolutely, sir. In experiences that I've seen in the department, task forces bring a tremendous amount of energy towards an issue. But how do you harness that over the long haul? If you hearken back on recent history, the Mine Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle Program, or the ISR Task Force, or the Counter IED Task Force, transitioning that to a program of record so institutionally you don't lose the tremendous momentum that was created. With respect to the Close Combat Lethality Task Force, it's remarkable what they've achieved in the last 2.5 years. We created the Army Futures Command. We have a soldier lethality investment portfolio. The investments that we're making, along with some of the task organizational changes, it's fundamentally changing the task organization of rifle platoons, making them more lethal. So this has been a big win for the department.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is critically important. As someone that served in an infantry unit, I think this is.
Yeah, could I just add on that?
Got to do it one second though, General. One thing that I did also want to ask, in a concern that I have, Secretary and General McConville, Major General Scales, who, as you know, was a part of this early on, has expressed his concern about removing this from being a joint force structure endeavor, bringing this over to the Army and leaving the Marine Corps behind. Something I think Secretary Mattis, envisioned this being a joint operation. So I wanted to ask, one, why move it just to the Army? And secondly, if that's what we ultimately do, how are you going to make sure that the Marine Corps continues to benefit? Because the Commandant on the Marine Corps sat here just last week, talked about how important this was for the Marine Corps as well.
Well, I think the Chief should comment as well, sir, but we're we're totally integrated. When we've gone down to test the next generation squad weapon or the IVAS system, there are Marines there from 1st Infantry Division. They have representatives from MECSITIC. So it is a Marine/soldier-centered design on these weapon systems. We're investing jointly. So I've been very encouraged by what I've seen. Every time we're there, we see Marines.
Good. I want to
Chief, you
continue
wanna
to see it that way. Anything, General?
No, the only thing I think we should give tremendous credit to the Close Combat Lethal Task Force is really the integrated visual augmentation system. We're calling it IVAS. That is transformational in nature. And as the Secretary said, that is going to change the way our combat soldiers, whether they're in the Marines or Special Forces, they actually rehearse for missions and the ability to go and do it. And it's almost like bringing an iPhone-type capability compared to a dial-up phone to the Army and
Couldn't
Marines.
agree with you more, General.
And
In fact,
we have, what's important is we have Marines right now that are working on that system, so we don't develop just for the Army. We have Special Forces that are working, and again, that is a huge difference along with the next generation combat weapons that we're
I'm
developing.
glad you brought that up. That's my next question. But I couldn't agree with you more. I came to the hearing you had here last year and played around with the augmented system. I thought absolutely amazing and can make a huge difference. I just want to stress to you both, I'm committed to making sure the Marines continue to benefit as well. But you did mention, General, the next generation squad weapon. I know you're looking to get that out to a unit in FY21. Could you just say a word or two about what kind of attributes you're looking for with this new weapon? What do you hope to accomplish with it?
Well, there's two weapons involved. It's really next generation carbine, a rifle, and also a squad weapon. And what these weapons will have is the capability to go through anything on the battlefield out to about 600 meters, and that's what we need, and that's what our soldiers, and that's what our Marines, and that's what our Special Forces need on the battlefield. So this will be a very lethal weapon, and it's pretty amazing how fast it's developing. And it'll be even more amazing how it'll link into the IVAS system. We're watching people with marksmanship that much greater than they ever had with an iron sight.
We got to get you down to Fort Benning. I went down and shot it last summer. 30% lighter. The ergonomics are very unique, so it made it very easy to hold. The 6.8 millimeter caliber rounds. It's going to be a big game changer for an infantry platoon.
Well, if you promise that I'll get to shoot, then I'm there. So thank you
Count
very
on it,
much.
sir.
I yield back my 10 seconds here.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your mention of Sergeant First Class Rodriguez. Mr. Secretary, it was honored to join you this morning at his funeral at Arlington along with Representative Gates. Ranger and Green Beret that it's worth noting has 10 years in the Army before he was killed. He was on his 9th tour in 10 years in the Army. So we're going to talk a lot today about Army budgets and preparing for great war competition, or great power competition, excuse me, and the wars that we want to deter, but we cannot in this committee, and I know you won't in the Army, forget the wars that we're in right now as we speak. Along those lines, I mean, going kind of big to small here, top line's likely is flat and likely going to stay that way, at least in my opinion. Personnel keeps eating up more and more of that budget in the out years. How do we modernize, recap, and procure with less and less budget over time? I know that's going to be just a matter of priorities. What are we going to do with and without?
Congressman, under current assumptions of a flat budget, we're faced with either flattening end strength, or tiering the modernization strategy. So that would be within the portfolios, choose divisions that you would scale first. Nothing but really very difficult challenges without an increased top line.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Can you just tell us for a moment, what are we doing to prepare in the Army and particularly the Guard for a pandemic? That the Guard being down in every single community, again, being from Florida, I know this first well, and still serving Guardsmen, will be the front lines in both preparedness and response. And I just wanted you to take a moment to share with the committee what we're doing proactively to prepare.
If I could, sir, I'd also like the Chief to comment as well. But Sir, over the last couple months, our medical research and development community, which is just truly exceptional, men and women like Dr. Kayvon Majard, who came up to us from the World Health Organization. He's one of 3 people on the earth that's actually published on the coronavirus. Dr. Nelson Michael, who was involved with how we faced the Zika and Ebola virus. So we have extraordinary people within the Army research and development community. We've organized against 3 lines of operation: prevention, detection, and treatment. On the prevention front, it's really where is every soldier and family member on the earth? And Vice Chief of Staff, the Army General Joe Martin, leads this meeting every day, and they're looking at where everybody is and making risk-based assessments. Do we turn off exercises? Do we deploy PCS? Because a lot of this is we're still learning about what happened in China. And how will it or will it not proliferate, and to what extent? So making these choices literally by individual and by unit every day. So that's the first thing on the prevention front, and continue learning. We're working on the vaccine. We were in concert with NIH and CDC. Dr. Michael is a protege of Dr. Fauci at NIH, so we have great relationships, but they're testing on animals right now. So ultimately get to a human sample within a couple months is what we're looking at, hopefully.
That's great.
And
Mr.
then
Secretary, if I can just take the rest for the
Yes, sir.
for the record. This committee in a prior NDA commissioned or directed a commission on national service, which is due, its report is due in the coming month. My colleague, Ms. Houlihan, and I, along with several of our other colleagues, have a national service bill. This is not a return to the draft. You do not necessarily have to be in uniform. It is national service across the board, and we believe we can incentivize that. I just want to get your assurance that I can't imagine that you would see this as competitive from a recruiting standpoint. I think, in fact, it would be complementary to have kids out in their community, Boys and Girls Club, Habitat for Humanity, but how do we get back to a sense of leadership, followership, discipline, and doing it with people that don't look like us? And I would think that would be absolutely great for the nation, great for the Army, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on the record.
Sir, any tool that we can have to find the best and brightest talent in the country to serve in uniform or as a civil servant, we'd want to go get them. So it'd be a great opportunity. I'd like to learn more.
Thank you. If I could just get a question for the record. One, your dependency on space assets. A lot of people don't associate Army with space. And then 2, how the National Guard is using its civilian skill set database, particularly in IT and in AI, excuse me, not in IT, but in AI, and how is that informing our recruiting for cyber and we were just over in the Jake, and for the recruiting challenges there. Thank you so much. Thank you both for your service.
We'll get them there this month, sir.
Rangers lead the way.
Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary McCarthy and General McConville, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your service. It's good to see you both again. And thank you also for mentioning Sergeant First Class Rodriguez from Las Cruces. He was the constituent of my neighbor, Congresswoman Torres Small, and we all mourn the loss and his passing, and our thoughts and prayers are with his family. So thank you for that. Secretary McCarthy, I am very concerned about the impact of continued MILCON project deferrals, and I'd like to get your insight on the path forward for us. Last year, $3.6 billion was taken from MILCON accounts across DoD, putting a number of the Army's critical infrastructure projects at risk of delay or cancellation. At Fort Bliss, this meant a safety-driven improvement to our access roads was put on hold. I also worry about the ripple effect of delays on projects slated for future years, and that we may be failing to prioritize strategic investments that are necessary as we face the specter of great power competition. For example, Fort Bliss's top MILCON priority is a rail yard improvement. As the largest joint mobilization platform in the DoD, they can already accommodate a throughput of 70,000 annually. However, they cannot presently meet Army standards for an armored brigade combat team deployment timeline because of the current track design. The necessary improvements would cost just $29 million and are imperative to meet the mission requirements. This is a sound investment, the Army's premier power projection platform for overseas contingency operations. Secretary McCarthy, when Secretary Esper was in your role last year, he said MILCOM priorities for the Army begin with readiness and power projection. Do you share his view? How do you see this kind of rail improvement fitting into those priorities? And General McConville would love your perspective as well.
Congressman, incredibly important. We conducted an emergency deployment readiness exercise from a brigade out of Fort Bliss last year, a heavy unit that went to Europe. They got the entire brigade on the ground in about 9 days. Remarkable performance, but we got to do everything we can to reduce that span time to get units from no notice to anywhere in the world. So incredibly important. We will continue to work and find ways to invest in these projects, to your point, because that is how we're going to be able to have the dynamic force projection necessary to meet national objectives.
Thank you.
Congressman, what I would add to what the Secretary said is when we look at readiness, there's two pieces to readiness, so to speak. One is strategic readiness, one is tactical readiness. Tactical readiness means the units are ready to go. They're all trained, they're equipped, and everything else like that. And strategic readiness is the ability to get them to the fight. And that's what we did with that brigade. And we know we need to improve those capabilities because that's how we do dynamic force employment, is to have the ability for strategic mobility, and all those come into play, and those are prioritized, and you know we certainly support them, but we got to prioritize within the budget we have.
Thank you. And speaking of strategic readiness, are there any lessons learned emerging from the Defender Europe 20 exercise regarding our mass deployment capabilities?
Yeah, what we're learning is, again, we're just starting to deploy right now, so we learned an awful lot from that brigade that came out of the 1st Armor Division, did a wonderful job. They got a no-notice deployment also, and what you find is with the deployment is sometimes whether it's the various facilities in countries that we go to, we learn a lot about that, and that's part of the reasons we want to test those capabilities, and that's why we're testing in Europe. We have an airborne jump going in there. We're drawing our prepositioned stocks. We're also shipping equipment over there to different ports, and then the ability to move it through Europe is something that we'll learn and share with our allies and partners to make sure that we can do this in a conflict.
Thank you. El Paso is a vibrant military community, as you both know full well, with 1 in 5 residents connected to Fort Bliss in one way or another, and an excellent spirit of collaboration for the Army's work. Particularly as MILCOM programs are being deferred, our committee has been eager to see swift implementation of the Defense Community Infrastructure Program. We heard last week from Secretary Esper that the early work to implement DSIP is underway. Just super quick, are you involved in these discussions?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, okay. We'd love guidance as soon as possible, please. I know my time has expired and I yield back. Thank you both.
Thank you. Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Secretary McCarthy and General McConville for being here. Time is finite, so I'll get right to the questions. This budget recognizes the importance of large-scale exercises and multi-domain operations seeking growth of strategic readiness exercises like Defender Europe and Defender Pacific. While these exercises are critical, there are also extensive exercises happening here at home. For example, Camp Grayling in Michigan is host to the DoD's largest joint reserve component, collective live fire readiness training event, Northern Strike. Last year, the exercise included over 7,000 personnel from 20 states and 7 countries, to include the likes of Latvia, Lithuania. This year, Liberia and the UK are also joining. What's your take on the need to expand and enhance exercises like Northern Strike in order to support the Army's top priority of multi-domain operations? And by the way, there's an invitation on the table if you haven't attended and can make it in August.
Well, Congressman, I'm very excited about these type of exercises because, first of all, they're home station. They're dealing with reserves, which I think is very, very important. There's a lot of capability up there. There's live fire involved, and also the fact that you have 7 countries. And you know, part of our strategy is to train with partners and allies, and so we have interoperability and we have the ability to know each other before we actually enter into a conflict. So I support these type of operations. They have to be nested within the budget we have, but I think they're very, very important for future readiness.
General McConville, back to you. The Army National Guard and the Army Reserve, but let's kind of focus on the Army Reserve right now, has historically reported lower readiness levels than the active component. That's to be expected because you're not there full time. And yet they are shouldering a pretty significant portion of the Army's logistical capabilities. What is your assessment of the current readiness of the reserve component? And as the Army seeks to grow the reserve within this budget, what are you doing to ensure that they are optimally manned, trained, and equipped to mobilize?
Well, first of all, Congressman, we're very proud of our reserve forces. We have asked an awful lot of them over the last 18, almost 19 years of combat. They've been side by side with us in every place we've been. And as far as their readiness, we are concerned about their op tempo. What we've moved to is more a focused readiness for our reserve forces to give them more predictability. We can't have them ready at the same level as regular Army units all the time. But as they come into windows and we can get them to the appropriate dwell time, we can train them up to be the right level of readiness and then employ them in line with the promises we made, either 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 deployment to dwell levels. And we are working that with the Chief of the Reserves.
Okay, and General McConnell, it seems like all my questions are focused on you, but that's okay. You know, as the Army seeks to modernization in its ground combat and tactical vehicle systems, how is modeling and simulation being utilized to realize potential savings, to rapidly field capabilities, to get the training up, and how is the Army looking to leverage virtual prototyping?
Yeah, I think model and simulation is absolutely critical, and it really comes down to, I want to say, resources. We can save money up front by modeling, simulating, whether it's designing prototypes, and actually it's amazing what you can do in a computer right now before you actually build prototypes. If you take a look at the strategy we have right now for the optionally manned fighting vehicle, that's exactly what we're doing, is we're going to make competitors show us a detailed design that we can actually model and simulate with before we go to prototype and before we finalize our requirements. So we make sure we have the right requirements in place and we don't waste money along the way to development. And the same thing with training and even testing out our systems. We are experimenting and simulating with the type of units that we're going to develop for multi-domain operations so we know whether they'll be successful in combat or not.
Well, you know, and I see my time is running short here. I'll just say I was really excited a couple of months ago. I went over across the river and saw IPSA and how the Army is going to do the integrated personnel system. There's no one, I'll just say specifically to the reserve and guard components, nobody joined to go to a drill center and have someone hold a piece of paper and say, is this your signature? Or here's another PowerPoint training. They joined to go to the field to be capable. And I'm counting on you all with the support that we have here to take that modeling and simulation, turn it into real training, so it's combat capability and readiness so when we need them. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Secretary McCarthy, General McConville, last week we heard from the Secretaries of Defense and the Navy, as well as Chairman Milley and CNO Gilday. At the top of many of our minds was the recent reprogramming action by the Department of Defense. To begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to echo the concerns of Ranking Member Thornberry expressed last week that these reprogramming actions substitute the judgment of the administration and the Department of Defense for the judgment of Congress. And I believe they pose a serious threat to our readiness efforts. To that end, I'd like to discuss the zeroing out of several National Guard and Reserve equipment and modernization accounts, including the entire Humvee Modernization Fund. As you know, the National Guard uses the Humvees not only on overseas deployments, but in their disaster response missions here at home. In my home state, Guard units were absolutely crucial to the response to Superstorm Sandy. Every year, significant natural disasters require National Guard response. In fiscal year 2020, Congress recognized the need to ensure the National Guard is fully equipped and ready to respond by appropriating nearly $1 billion for National Guard equipment and modernization. In fact, for more than 37 years, Congress has addressed the equipment needs of the National Guard by providing funding for improved equipment needed but not requested by the senior service of each. And at no time in those 37 years has the DoD explicitly gone against the will of Congress and abused the reprogramming authority like this. The most recent reprogramming zeroed out that appropriation, and I'm concerned that this undermines the relationship between this committee and the DoD, as well as undermines and undervalues the contributions of our National Guard. I think it also undermines our ability as a country to respond to natural disasters and thereby makes our citizens less safe. So, General McConville, what impact will these reprogramming decisions related to National Guard modernization have on the Guard's ability to respond to natural disasters here at home?
Well, as you know, it was $801 million from the Army that was reprogrammed. $100 million in HEMTs, $100 million in Humvees, and then $395 million out of the GRIA fund for the National Guard, and $205 million out of the reserve fund. And you know, from what that's going to do, that was determined that the Southwest border support was a higher priority than those elements, and is
not by Congress.
That's correct. And you know, from our standpoint, what that's going to deprive is, as you said, is the National Guard will not have those Humvees. The other units will not have those HEMTs, and there were some other requirements that the National Guard, from a lot associated with, you know, from putting the capability to put out fires, the capability to conduct operations with night vision capability that were in the degree of fund that will not be funded.
And Secretary McCarthy and General McConville, I fully support the Army's focus on modernization, and I know Picatinny Arsenal is key in the development efforts for long-range precision fires, which has been identified as the Army's #1 modernization priority. Can you update the committee on the LRPF's, the programs, and how the Army's working with industry and academia to further modernize?
Yeah, that portfolio in particular is performing very well, from a tactical range artillery, the extended range cannon artillery, which is on a Paladin PIM system. We tested those out in Yuma last fall, doubled the range from about 30, mid 30 kilometer range to north of 70 with wraparounds hitting with precision. The precision strike missile, which was is the ATACMS replacement, which has at the operational level has twice the volume, and we are, now that we are in a post-INF world, we'll be able to prosecute distances in the north of 600 kilometers. It conducted a test that was range constraint last fall and hit with precision at 240 kilometers. So it's going to increase this test regime in this calendar year. Very excited about that, and in particular, from a strategic standpoint with hypersonics. This is a joint interest program, and I emphasize the word interest, that we're working with the Navy, the Air Force, and the Missile Defense Agency, so where we're finding economies of scale in the buys. We're sharing test data. The teams are fully integrated. We have 2 test shots this year with hypersonics, and that we're looking to field a battery by FY23 deployable. So north of $1 billion invested just in this year alone. We're very excited and put a lot of energy behind the long-range fires portfolio.
I'll submit a question for the record because my time's expired. I would love to hear how you're partnering with industry and academia and further efforts on that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both gentlemen for being here today. As my colleagues said, time is short, so I'll get quickly to the questions. Let's continue on the discussion of the Optionally Manned Fighting Vehicle. As you are both aware, I had the opportunity to meet with program leadership about that program. The Army had identified a need to update those, to get a new vehicle. Began a prototype solicitation, and then, surprisingly, abruptly canceled that. The concerns I expressed, I don't know, a month, 6 weeks ago, were about schedule delays, cost overruns, and a dilution of the capabilities of that vehicle as we then go forward. So my question for both of you continues to be, what guarantees the Army is going to offer that we're not going to see significant schedule delays and cost overruns, given we've canceled that and we're now going back to square one? Can anyone tackle whichever?
Congressman, I'd like to take that if I could. As you know, we took a step back from our approach on the obsolete manned fighting vehicle. You know, some people, I would like to say we learned early, and we learned early before we invested a lot of money in the system, which was not the way we did things in the past. We learned that we were going down a road with requirements that industry could not meet, so we took a step back. We took a look at our approach, and what we've done is we've put out a paper on characteristics that we want, vice requirements. As soon as we say requirements, what happens to industry, that means they have to meet the exact prescriptive requirement. So we've actually changed the process. We're talking about characteristics. We'll go to a initial design and bring the field down small. We'll go to a detailed design, which talks about simulation.
And I agree. And
we'll go to prototypes, which will allow us to get the requirements right before we invest.
What's going to happen in the schedule, in your opinion, General?
For
What's going to happen in the schedule?
I think the schedule.
What delays we're going to have?
What I think is going to happen with the schedule is we've got a better shot of getting the vehicle we want in a more timely manner at the cost we need. So the schedule is set up to bring industry partners along. Both those are going to design the vehicle, but also those are going to bring technology into this system that may be non-traditional partners, and that's where we're going to get transformational change.
I agree with your assessment about the process and the procurements. I sit with Mr. Banks on the Future Defense Task Force. One thing that's been clear to us is that as procurements have been done, we've not only talked about the problem, we've also identified, quote, requirements that may or may not allow for innovation, and they've caused issues with procurement. In this case, we have at least one contractor, but several that put major money, significant money and energy into doing a prototype. If we're going to, and now we pulled it. If we're going to get private sector money involved, and we're going to get innovation either through venture capital, those types of things, we need to focus more on laying out the problem and then let them come up with ideas rather than have them focus significant sums of money on a prototype only to be told we changed our mind. That certainly does not help with getting people to invest and assist us in developing what we need for the future.
Congressman, that's exactly it. If you where the chief and I got personally involved with this one in particular, is we went and looked and adopted a similar acquisition strategy to that of the integrated visual augmentation system, where we used the authorities that were granted to us by this committee, the other transaction authority, where we could put more, allow the contractor to unleash the engineering talent of these companies to helping us solve the problem. So by bringing in more of these contractors, they can develop these prototypes, they can come forward and help us solve the problem. Because the points the chief was making, this is entirely about outcomes. And at times when we go into the 5,000 series mode and it becomes ultra specific on requirements, they're not going to bring their better ideas. So a lot of the changes that have been made over the last couple of years from the authorities you've all granted, we're using them now.
Well, let me restate that I still await more specific details on what adjustments in the schedule that was originally for this procurement, or they put in the field, frankly, and then what we anticipate to be the schedule, the cost changes for this compared to what originally projected. I still await those. I think the committee does as a whole, and we'd like to see this as soon as you have a moment, some time to look at that. It's critically important, as you well know. Let me change gears a little bit, but similar theory. The advanced combat engine is another topic that is a concern, and it is for a similar reason. There's an argument there that there's a commercially available off-the-shelf engine that will do what it is that we're now trying to procure for, and we're putting government money into doing. Have you looked at that, and why are we investing in developing our own version if, in fact, there are engines that do that, and understand there are?
Yeah, we'll take I know there's engines out there right now. That's part of the process about when we put a characteristics that what we're trying to do with our acquisition system is change from a linear industrial age system where we develop our own. If industry's got it, we want to put the characteristics out there so they can bring it in. What we're trying to do, and we're having success in a lot of the areas, is drive before we buy and fly before we buy. And if they have an engine, what we're trying to get our acquisition professionals, bring it on in, show us what you got, don't have it on PowerPoint slides, and then if it works, why not use it?
One moment, definitely.
Jim's time has expired.
One moment, if I could, just 1 second. I think you're having a problem with getting, because the people contend they have this, but I think you've got a middle layer that information is not getting to you. And that, I think, it needs to be a concern for all of us in terms of what we can spend on defense. So I appreciate your deference, sir. I yield back.
Ms. Torres-Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, General McConville and Secretary McCarthy, as well as my colleagues, for recognizing the sacrifice of Sergeant First Class Antonio Rodriguez. At his services in Las Cruces, I was struck by the family's love and sorrow and pride in him and the impact that had on his broader family in the community, from school kids just across the street from where the services were to his brothers and sisters in arms. And that sacrifice reinforces for me all of our responsibility to protect our soldiers, both with the current threats that they face and the threats that they will face in the future. And to that end, I have been reviewing the budget for the Army modernization programs, and it appears to be a mix of good and bad news. The good news is that the Army has increased production of proven systems and shifted about $31 billion over future years' defense program into higher priority modernization programs. But the Army still appears to be several years away from having new generations of systems in production. General McConville, what briefly is the department's plan to move from testing to production and training for use of these weapons?
Well, we think we've got a very aggressive method to get after the production. One of the things that you've given us the authorities to do this with these other transaction authorities is the training's happening right now. So as we develop these new systems, soldiers are on them, and soldiers are telling us where we need to go. And what we're trying to do is get the prototype. The way we used to do it was we would have people sit around for 5 to 7 years and write a prescriptive requirement document that might fill up the top of this roof. And what would happen is industry would go down for the next 5 to 7 years trying to meet those requirements without much feedback from the operators that were going to use it. And then we'd end up with something with 10, 12, 15 years from now, which is really no longer relevant to what we want to do.
And I agree with you, 10 to 15, 12 years is no longer relevant.
Right, so the systems, we're looking at 2 or 3 years right now. The Secretary and I have talked, the hypersonics, we're going to be fielding a battery, a mobile battery in 3 years. So.
I'm pleased to hear that you'll be fielding a mobile battery of hypersonics in 3 to 4 years. Now, our near-peer competitors like China and Russia are testing and fielding these types of weapon systems at a faster rate than the United States. Given that, just in a few words, what is the department's level of priority to implement your plan of 2 to 3 years?
Well, I think as far as like long-range precision fires and hypersonics is the #1 priority. We are moving out very quickly. I think we'll see some news very shortly on where we are on that over the next couple of months. And
thank you. And #1 priority, I'm excited to see the announcements coming up in the next couple of months.
Sure.
We're investing in this next generation of weapon systems to deter great power conflict, and at the same time, we also need reliable force structure, given the high level of day-to-day deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, and dozens of other global hotspots. How do we balance modernization and readiness?
Well, it's really 3 things. It's readiness, modernization, and end strength. And so what we're doing when it comes to end strength is we have modest growth. We could sit here and tell you we need this many people, but we know we're not going to get them. So we're making sure that every person counts that's in the Army. They're deployable, they're fit, and they can do their job. As far as readiness is, we are invested in readiness in the units that are most likely to go to combat, because we got to make sure we're ready now. We saw that with the 82nd Airborne Division. And at the same time, we're going to have to divest very carefully systems that they're going to preclude us from investing in the future. We must invest in the future. We've done simulation experimentation to look at our future systems with the concepts we're going to have, and that gets us the results that we need to have.
Thank you, General McConville, and I appreciate that you are investing effectively and targeted. And as would you agree, as Secretary McCarthy mentioned, that every bullet counts when it comes to priority.
Every person counts. Every dollar counts.
Every dollar counts. So you just told me about how we need to invest in next generation weapons, especially hypersonic missile testing, and that every dollar counts. Yet just last year, White Sands Missile Range lost $40 million in MILCON funding for a new consolidated information technology facility, when those funds were redirected to the border wall. The current IT facility at White Sands was built in 1962. It recently suffered from a fire because of an overloaded system. So the new facility was supposed to support new missile and weapons tests, including hypersonics. Without the new facility, the DoD could fall behind on its testing requirements. General McConville, have you discussed the impact of the outdated IT facility with WSMR?
I have not.
How will the delay of the construction of IT facilities impact research and testing of new weapon systems?
Well, we'll have to take a look. I'll have to talk to them and make sure we understand it. As we put the tests
Okay.
together with hypersonics and some of these other systems, they will go to the test area that has the appropriate amount of equipment to do that.
Well, I'd like to get some additional information for the record, so thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much. And I actually was out visiting White Sands. I think that is a crucial issue. I mean, this is why the MILCON issues are important. They prepare us. They are part of readiness. And in this case, the testing out there is enormously important to just about everything you do. Make sure it works. So getting that up to date quickly is enormously important. With that, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A moment ago, Mr. Mitchell mentioned our work on the Future of Defense Task Force. We're nearing the end of our task force. I co-chair it with Mr. Moulton on the other side. It's a purely bipartisan effort. As we near the end of our task force, all along the way, we've been working closely with the Defense Innovation Board and other organizations to implement personnel changes and technology upgrades all across the department. The Defense Innovation Board recommended that the DoD, quote, create various education and training opportunities for senior leaders to understand new technologies and innovation methodologies such as data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, lean startup, and design thinking, end quote. Mr. Secretary, as you noted in your joint statement, quote, the Army can no longer be an industrial age Army in the information age. We are shifting from simply distributing personnel to more deliberately managing our soldiers and civilians' talents, end quote. I wonder, Mr. Secretary, if you could comment for a moment on how the Army's Talent Management Task Force is doing and aligning with the recommendations of the Defense Innovation Board to educate senior leaders on capabilities such as artificial intelligence.
Yes, sir. I would also, if I could ask the General McConville to comment, the task force was his idea, so he's been the champion of this for several years now. Really, there's a couple factors. We need an integrated personnel and pay system. If you were to evaluate an individual today, you get an officer record brief, and it'll say 82nd, 101st, and they got jump wings. And you don't really have enough information about an individual to make the best decision possible. Is this the right person for the right job? It's also an opportunity for the individual to know a lot about themselves, so for career management. Some of it also is philosophy and the manner in which we select individuals. And Chief, you want to talk about the Battalion Commander's Assessment Program?
Sure. Thank you, Secretary and Congress. We're in a war for talent right now in the United States Army, okay? And we are aggressively going after that. And the good thing is when we're competing for young men and women is they're not necessarily motivated by compensation. They're motivated by purpose, and they're motivated by being on a team, and they want to make a contribution. I would argue that the problem with our personnel system, I talked about this, it was industrial age. It treated everyone the same. Young men and women don't want to be treated the same. We have tremendous talent in our National Guard and Reserves that's mass because they're a sergeant of infantry or a captain of engineers. We look behind the curtain, we find out that they own an engineering design firm, or they're data scientists, or they have all these incredible capabilities, or they're good at infectious disease. And so what we need is an information age system that we're implementing right now in the National Guard that's going to go to the rest of the Army, the integrated personnel and pay system where we can recognize people by 25 variables, not 2 variables, on what their knowledge, skills, behaviors, and even the notion of what their preferences are, what they want to do and where they want to go. And we think this is the best way ahead, and we appreciate your support in the integrated personnel and pay system.
I agree with you very much. Let me shift gears for a moment. The Army has indicated that it plans to invest in advanced lasers capable of firing at higher power levels. The laser head is a core piece of a directed energy system, so these are critical investments. However, I'm concerned that similar efforts are not being made to invest in systems that power and cool these systems. In fact, DoD leaders have indicated thermal management is among the most significant challenges in directed energy development and could take millions of dollars and years of development to complete. Mr. Secretary, why is the Army not pursuing a power and thermal management development plan, knowing that that delay could add years to the fielding of directed energy systems?
Sir, we've been successful with a 50 kilowatt laser test on a Stryker vehicle. We're looking at how can we integrate in the upwards of 100 to 150 kilowatt on the same platform. To your point, much of the challenge is the cooling, the integration of that, will be the propulsion capability execute the shots. But big challenge for us is the platforms in our formations. General Neil Thurgood from our Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technology Task Force is developing plans on that, and it'll be reflected in our budget submittals in the future.
Okay, that's all I got. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary McCarthy, General McConville. Appreciate your continued service to the country. At the beginning of the testimony, General McConville, you mentioned that we have 190,000 troops in 140 different countries. We also have over 20,000 joint troops deployed as part of Defender Europe right now throughout Europe. Sitting here today, are you comfortable that the Army has sufficient coronavirus test kits, medical supplies, and the training, both OCONUS and our forward deployed locations, but also at our posts throughout the world to address the threat?
Well, we want to make sure we have more, Congressman. I'm never satisfied with what we have. We are going to great lengths to mitigate the risk of all our soldiers. Very concerned about South Korea. We've stopped exercises. We're very concerned with some of our troops coming out of Italy. We've adjusted exercises. One of the things that we're doing with our task force is they say that they have the capability to rapidly develop tests that can handle a much larger scale. So I'm never satisfied with what we have. I think we can do better, and we want to make sure that our soldiers and families have every capability to protect them against this virus if it comes their way.
So what do you need to do? What needs to be done, I would say, to make sure that you are satisfied in a place where...
Well, I think what's being done is the Secretary talked about these experts that at least we have that work for the Army that have told us in about 2 or 3 months that they can develop, with the right resources, and we have given them the resources to go ahead and develop a test capability that's much larger in scale. We can do it at small numbers now, 50, 60, so many a day, but we need to get up to thousands where we can really turn these. We have the capability to test now, but I want to be sure that the tests are, 100%. I mean, people say you never get to that, but we have certain screening that we're doing for all our soldiers coming back from Korea. We just had the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division come back, and they're getting screened all along the way, so we don't have someone come back.
Every soldier is being screened?
Yes, Congress. Every soldier is being screened at multiple times during the redeployment to make sure that they don't have a problem with that.
Let us know, if there are additional resources that are needed to deal with it. We said the same thing to Secretary Esper and General Milley last week as well. Shifting gears here, Congressman Lamborn at the beginning was absolutely right in the opening statement that our reliance on certain fossil fuels is a vulnerability for us. The same applies for our installations as well. Actually, Congressman Bacon and I just started a Military Resiliency and Energy Caucus, that's MRE Caucus, which we're very proud of. It's a bipartisan effort to address this issue of our installations. So I know the Army, a couple of installations, including Fort Hood, have gone to microgrids and trying to not only reduce operating costs, reduce carbon footprint, but also increase resiliency and address the threats from cyber attack as well. Can you both comment on what the next phase of that build-out would be and what you're doing to move that forward with haste?
Well, we have other posts. As you may know, Hawaii has a power plant there on post that we can use. Fort Knox went to natural gas. They have that capability, and as I'll defer to the Secretary, but we have many posts that are very concerned about the ability for resilience and also low-cost energy.
Mm-hmm. No, sir. We, to the Chief's point, it's been we look at this, been priority for the force comm installations in particular, and then we'll continue to flesh out a plan and put more investment towards this.
Is there more investment that's needed? I mean, do you need more resources from Capitol Hill to actually expedite those efforts?
So I'd have to get more particulars for you, sir, but it'd probably be good if we came and sat down with the caucus in particular and probably be a good starting point.
Because what we do know is that when we make those investments in the front end, it actually reduces operating costs in the back end. So you look at long-term costs, those are investments that we could make that could actually reduce overall fixed costs in the future and free up resources for other efforts as well. And then just last, dovetailing on Mr. Banks's thoughts on recruiting, we haven't been meeting our recruiting goals. We're projecting an increase in force structure. It's a tough job market. We need to hire talent that can address 21st century technology. What are we doing to change the model of recruiting to do those things?
Well, Congressman, you helped us in Denver just last fall, but we changed our strategy to 22 cities around the country. We were engaging civic leaders. We changed our marketing firm to address the types of opportunities that exist in the U.S. Army, 150 different operational specialties, advancement in opportunity and financing for advanced education. A lot of it is just getting more in touch with this 17 to 24-year-old generation. And it's also senior leader involvement. The chief and I go out to cities, and we go with members of Congress, and we meet with civic leaders to help us talk to those influencers to encourage young men and women for a life of service.
Yep. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. Secretary McCarthy, you recently said at CSIS, I believe, that Army modernization costs and personnel costs are on a collision course, yet you're proposing to add an additional 2,400 active duty soldiers to Army end strength. Can you explain how you plan to mitigate that collision course?
Yes, sir. When you have one-to-one bog to dwell time, we have to increase the size of the force, and we're on a trajectory to hit 492,000 on the active force by the end of this fit-up. But when the point that I was trying to emphasize is without an increased top line, under current demand, we will be faced in 22 or 23 with flattening end strength, tiering modernization, or reducing our ambition within our modernization efforts.
General McConville, could you explain the logic behind the Army requesting $364 million to do a division-sized Defender Pacific exercise in the Pacific? In other words, is there how do I put this? Is the Marine Corps not currently postured to perform defensive and offensive missions in Indo-PACOM such that Army needs to fill the void?
Well, first of all, the Marine Corps is a fabulous service that does great things for the country, and I think we work together very, very closely. But what the Army brings is it brings mass. It brings a large capability. And again, as we look at the national defense strategy, the priorities are China and Russia and our partners out there, and many of the leaders in the countries that, whether it's the Thailand or it's the Philippines or it's Indonesia, their armies want to work with us. And so I think it's very, very important that we demonstrate that we have the ability to move forces into that region, that we have the capability to train and interoperate with these countries that want to be our friends and partners, and that's what the importance of this exercise is.
So in simplest terms, what would the Army do in a no-kidding Westpac contingency, for example, a war with China over Taiwan?
Well, I think what the Army does is it provides deterrence, just like if you want to get back to World War II, and not that we're going to take islands. We don't know as far as what the threat's going to be, but here's what we do know is we know that the countries in the region that border the South China Sea want the Army's capabilities. Right now, they want our security force assistance brigades. They want us to advise and assist to build their capabilities. They want our multi-domain task force capabilities, at least the COCOM commander does. And almost to a country, and many of the ones I've met with it, they want to train with our soldiers.
Secretary McCarthy, how does the Army plan to meet what is its primary joint mission, if I read correctly, in Indo-PACOM, which is to defend our air bases and logistics hubs against low-flying cruise missiles? Remember, this committee, we identified that as really the modern-day missile gap. In other words, we can shoot down IRBMs and SRBMs. We can hit high-flying cruise missiles with Patriots, but we can't. That gap is that low-flying cruise missile. How do you intend to address that gap?
Two ways, sir. First and foremost, you have to have the footprint in that area of the world. So getting our forces west of the international date line with greater duration is critical. So the points that Chief was making about the relationships, is it expeditionary basing, is it longer duration of the deployments in places like Thailand, the Philippines, and others. So that's critical. The second, to your point, we are pursuing the Iron Dome system. What we've kind of left our options open on the out years with IFPC because we need to get more data from the manufacturer so we can see if adjustments have to be made to that system in order to meet a cruise missile threat.
What early successes could you point to for those who might be skeptical about the future of Army Futures Command?
Like all things, sir, it's new. It has to prove itself and deliver the results. What I think if you can look early on is that it's brought all the stakeholders of the modernization continuum together, and it's got warfighters at the seat at the table talking about the characteristics of the weapon systems that they need. But it's as much materiel as it is the way that you fight, and the recognizing that materiel will change the operating model. So it's been critical to do this because, obviously we've been very busy the last 19 years, but changing our organizational construct so that the warfighters at the table driving these materiel efforts in particular.
And for those who would point out that kind of Boston and Silicon Valley are really the hubs for this type of stuff, do you still think Austin is the place?
Absolutely, sir. We have footprints, and that we have the Center for Army Analysis out at Berkeley. We have research at MIT. We have strong relationships there. And Austin is one of the most entrepreneurial cities in America. We have a strong partnership with the University of Texas, which is top-tier engineering and business school. We're partnered with a Capital Factory, which is a entrepreneurial footprint where you bring in small, medium.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. The
Yes,
gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming. I'm going to follow up on some of the questions of Mr. Crow as well as Mr. Banks regarding talent and specifically tech talent. Last year, I introduced a bipartisan Armed Forces Digital Advantage Act, which establishes a policy to recruit, retain, and promote tech talent and digital expertise at the DoD. Much of the bill was enacted last year in Section 2030 in the NDAA. So I guess my questions to follow on Mr. Banks and Mr. Crow's questions are, I did have the opportunity to go to, not related, but somewhat related, the JAIC this week, and they did talk significantly about the struggle for tech talent, specifically about security clearances and the speed with which they were able to attain them, and the fact that people were basically disappearing on them because they didn't want to wait, or onboarding problems where it was a struggle to get people hired fast enough before they had 5 or 6 other offers. And then, frankly, they also talked about this. I know the narrative is that we're all patriots and we'd like to serve, and I served as well as an engineer. But the reality is, when it's 2, 3, 5 times, 10 times salary differential, there is a struggle when you're trying to make that decision of service. So can you talk a little bit about, since you're the largest service, what you're doing in these areas to make sure that we can retain and recruit tech talent?
Yes, ma'am. I would also like the Chief to weigh in if I could. We're partnering closer. We put footprints forward, like Artificial Intelligence Task Force. We put it on the campus of Carnegie Mellon University or on the campus of the University of Texas. We're trying to get closer to academia so that we can try to encourage young men and women when they're in those formative years, like in college or graduate school, for opportunities in the civil service as well as the uniform side of the house. It is very challenging. Compensation is dramatically different from just a financial standpoint. There are authorities that have been granted by this committee that we can use to make them highly qualified experts and others, but still, it presents a challenge. Getting us better relationships with business and academia has been key, and we've been successful in a handful of instances. Chief?
I think it's really important that we expose these extraordinary young men and women to the Army. And you've given us the authorities now to do things like direct hiring, and we talk a lot, at our level, we're talking about data scientists. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that we need to get. We've been working with cyber, same type thing, and the system needs to be more flexible. Again, we have an industrial age personnel, and I was a former G1. We're trying to change that as we go forward, but what we've found is, not it's an anecdotal example, but for a cyber sergeant, only about 10 of them in the world that could do what this sergeant could do. He wanted to stay in the Army even though he was getting mid-six figures offers. He said we'd stay in the Army if we made him a GS-13. Now, the system initially was not going to do that because that's not what our system does, because he's an E5, he should be a GS-6. But we have the capability to make him a GS-13. He is staying in the Army. He can only do things that he's doing in cyber in the Army. No other place can he do that legally. And those are the type of things that we offer. Is
there more that the Congress can authorize you to do? They commented at the JAIC that there was concern that we wanted to be able to create a number of billets that would exceed the Vice President's salary, as an example. Are there other things that we can do to make sure that we retain these talented people?
I think that we're really looking hard at where we can direct hire. We've done that for the engineers. The engineers now can do a lot of direct hiring. We just got to make sure with these precise areas we can do the direct hiring that we need to do. Just like you said, we go to a lot of these engineering forums, and they had to be before when we went, okay, in 6 months we'll try to get you on board. Now they can hire right away, but the direct hiring has a lot of capability.
I'm sorry, with the last minute of my time, I wanted to completely change gears and talk about family housing and barracks. But the budget that you all put forward states that the Army looks to address family housing and barracks, yet it looks like, according to the budget that you've put forward, you're looking to increase personnel but reducing family housing, your request by $62 million and Millicon by $810 million. How do you reconcile that difference where you'd like to increase the number of billets but you're decreasing the ways that you're supporting them?
We have to recapitalize about a third of the housing in that are managed across our portfolio, and what we're looking at is some of these homes just have to be taken down, and what we're looking at is potentially external financing options through the companies that manage the on-post housing today, because it would require north of $10 billion. To essentially recapitalize the homes across the entire Army.
So the answer is you're looking to private industry to solve the issue?
Well, we're looking at potential options there because it'd be just the astronomical costs it would take to recapitalize the entire footprint.
I've run out of time, but I really like to have a follow-on conversation about you because the private industry solution hasn't seemed to be working for us in the housing area, but I have to yield back. I appreciate it.
I'll reach out, man.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, Chief, it's great to see y'all today. I want to start out just by talking a little bit about you, General McConville, and I get to see you up close sometimes, and it's great. And General McConville, this is for all those soldiers out there. I hope they're listening. It's people first, winning matters, and Army strong. And you mean that, and I want you to talk a little bit about that because I know how much people, and I got to sit in when you talked about what you're doing for housing and all those things that matter, and so I know that you're engaged in those, and thank you for that because people truly matter to you, and I appreciate that. But talk a little bit about what we're doing for data mining, and a little bit about your battalion command assessment program that just had General McGee in yesterday. Great program, and what you're doing in talent management, because you've got some great ideas that are going to be the Army of the future.
Well, thank you, Congressman. And again, the Army is people. It's our greatest strength. It's our most important weapon system. When I'm talking about people, I'm talking about our soldiers from the regular Army, from the National Guard, and from reserves. And the point I make is 53% of our soldiers are in the reserves. And we should never forget what they do for us. And 88% of our sergeants above have families. So we cannot forget about our families. And we have 249,000 Department of the Army civilians who labor every single day making things happen for us. And we cannot forget our soldiers for life, our retirees, and our veterans, because we have an obligation to them. So those are our people. And the feeling is that if we get our people in the right place, the right time, doing the right thing with the right resources, everything else follows. We'll have readiness, we'll have modernization, and we will have reform. And that's why our people are so important. And I can talk a little about what we're trying to do as far as the Battalion Command assessment program. Picture right now the NFL combines going on. We just did ours, but what we did is we took our battalion commanders, who I consider the most consequential rank because they influence the people below them. They're also our future leaders, and we ran them through a 5-day assessment. A 5-day assessment to make sure that they had all the attributes that we thought they needed to be successful battalion commanders, and we had very good results from that.
I'm a great supporter of that program. I do have, my one concern is, like everyone else, I don't like the way that we went about this reappropriation of the budget. And I think the Guard took a huge hit on that. And it's hard to build trust when you tell guys we're going to field you in the future, but we're going to take away what we're going to field you. So when we're talking about NAGRIA and those things, there's some long-term trust that we've got to work on. And I think General McConville and Secretary McCarthy, I think you guys can help us if you let us know what your plan is so that we don't lose a readiness gap in the Guard and Reserve in equipping and manning and all those things. So take that for the record. The other thing I want to talk about is the Futures Command, and General Murray's doing great work down there. And I like what we're doing, and I hope you guys will brief us on where you are. But I want to make sure we're focusing on engineer equipment. You know, we're doing Defender 2020. I've got my old engineer brigade is going down range to support that. But the most complex things we do in war as an Army is river crossing and complex breaches. And I'm not sure that our engineer equipment is any different today than it was when I got in as a second lieutenant in 1988. What are we looking at in futures for engineering equipment?
No, it's a great question, and one of the reasons that we're going to Europe, and one of the reasons we're doing a wide gap crossing right now is to demonstrate that we actually need that capabilities. A lot of the places we've been for the last 20 years conducting operations, we didn't need that type of equipment. And when it came to priorities, and you only have so much top line, you go to where you need. But as we move into great power competition, and we look at the type of forces that we need to deter those potential adversaries, engineering equipment and even engineering units are absolutely key. We brought them back into the BCTs. We got rid of them. We're bringing them back. And we're taking a look at we recognize some of the gaps, and we're going to put some programs together to fill those gaps.
General McConnell, I'm going to leave my last just on a comment, but you're from the great state of Massachusetts, and we built our Army on the Massachusetts militia. The first active duty Army was built on the Massachusetts militia. We are a great Army, and we've never won a war that we've not engaged our National Guard. And so I just ask that when we're fielding and equipping, they're an operational force, and we have to equip them and man them. And then we also have to be cautious. But please, and I know you're doing that, but thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and General, thank you both for being here today. Mr. Secretary, I'll start with you. Understanding the Army's desire to transform itself into newly proposed multi-domain operation concept, this will require the Army to fully integrate with other services and have access to national level capabilities. What is the level of buy-in and resourcing do you have from the Department of Defense and the other services?
Sir, we meet on this topic every Monday with Secretary Esper, the chiefs, service secretaries, the unders, beaming in the COCOMs. The big part of us getting to an NDS implemented force is the joint warfighting concept. And you really look at two lines of operation there. In the tank, where the chiefs are going to look at this, that's how our disposition worldwide, the types of capabilities we need to meet operational plans. General Milley is driving that. And then internally to the business side, we have to look at our architecture, and then how do we communicate. That's as much as our integrated battle command system being complementary to the the advanced battle management system that the Air Force is driving. So it's that command and control capability, but it's also the space. We're going to need a common transport layer within the satellite architecture so that we can transfer the data, which will ultimately be cloud-driven. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, cloud architecture is something we're pursuing in the Army. The Vice Chief and Acting Undersecretary McPherson are the two running point on this for the department. So cloud architecture, our complementary command and control nodes, our disposition worldwide, as some of the questions we've had before. Where are our forces? Terrain matters. And then ultimately, the satellite architecture.
All right, thank you. General McConville, in fiscal year 2019, the Army experienced a total of 55 Class A mishaps and 61 Class B mishaps, which resulted in 28 casualties and approximately $362 million in damage or lost equipment. These mishaps occurred in training and operational environments and were not combat losses. While it's understood that military training is inherently dangerous, the committee is concerned by these recent trends and questions as to whether changes are required to training program safety standards and/or range safety practices. Can you comment on any reviews currently underway to review the safety of the Army training or any initiatives being implemented to improve safety and reduce the number of mishaps?
No, Congressman, I'm very concerned about some of the training exercise we had where we're starting to have vehicles rolling over and people not wearing seat belts, and we lost some soldiers very tragically. And some of this is getting back to being around very large, expensive equipment where we started maneuvering our forces, which was very different than we were doing before. All of a sudden, when you have armored vehicles moving in very difficult terrain, we had to get back to some of the basics. So the focus is really a bottom-up focus. It's getting back to the squad level. It's getting back to the team level. It's giving the junior leaders a chance to learn how to do their jobs. Many of our more mid-rank and senior leaders are very experienced. You know, they got multiple combat tours. They've been doing this business a long time. But we bring 130,000 soldiers into the Army every single year. They're coming right off the block. They need time to learn how to drive their vehicles. They need time to how to maneuver the vehicles. And that's a changing focus that we think is very, very important, because we are not satisfied, or certainly we've got to fix that. We cannot have that many accidents. We cannot lose soldiers in training, and we're doing everything we can do to fix that.
So was there anything that you implemented? I mean, was there an overview of procedures?
There certainly was an overview of procedures, but as you do the analysis, if you find out that we're in vehicles and we're rolling over and we're not wearing our seatbelts,
Right.
and if you are wearing your seatbelts, you survive. If you're not wearing your seatbelts, you don't. I mean, some of that's just basics that we need to get back to. If you're in a assembly area and you're not ground guiding your vehicles and you're at night, you start to make these mistakes that can result in tragedies that should not happen in a unit. This is basic soldiering, and we don't necessarily need to change our policies. We need to execute them and make sure that we have given our soldiers at the lowest level the training that they need to do to make sure that they're successful in the battlefield.
All right, thank you, General. And just real quick, I got 12 seconds left here, but you know, we've talked before previously with both of you about the diversity in your officer corps and what you're doing. You're implementing it. Would love to come and talk to you more about that, and when we have some time.
We'll have to take that for the
sir.
record.
Yes, thank you.
And Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. I want to start off talking about munitions. And General McConville, we obviously have significant challenges in both capacity as well as capability, and our stockpiles have really been used in the last 15 years. So I was wondering, what is your assessment of the risk in the Army's precision-guided and preferred munitions request?
Well, we have done a lot of work over the last 2 years. We've put billions of dollars into munitions, and I think that as we did assessment of a possible situation that we would have been in, we quickly realized that we needed to invest in munitions, and we stood up that capability. We're doing an assessment right now to make sure that we have the right amount. You know, as we look at what's the best strategic way to take the amount of munitions we have so that each combatant commander has the necessary munitions in place, and we're continuing to invest in that as a priority within the top line that we have.
Yeah. So along with that is the industrial base. So what specific actions are you taking to manage stability, capability, and capacity risk in the U.S. munitions industrial base to include reducing critical supply chain dependencies sourced from outside the United States?
Yeah, you know, in fact, General Perna is working that very, very closely. He's our AMC commander, and he's been taking a look at that exactly. We do not want to be dependent on one chain. We're doing some other things that when we look at how our ammunition is manufactured, where it's manufactured, and trying to keep competition in the system.
Good. I think that's key, so I'm glad to hear that. Secretary McCarthy, I understand the Army Futures Command has reached full operational capability, and I recognize the good work that the cross-functional teams are doing with respect to modernization. But looking ahead, logistics and combat enablers, such as Army engineers, we just had a discussion with Representative Kelly about, they're going to be critical to any future conflict against a peer competitor. And I know, General, I was encouraged to hear your response to my colleague that engineers are key and that you're setting up programs to fill the gaps. You're seeing some gaps perhaps in the exercises that are going on over in Europe. So this fits right in with my question. Are there any plans to stand up a cross-functional team that could be focused on logistics equipment modernization? And if not, what is the Army currently doing? Maybe you could expound on these programs to fill the gaps to address these challenges related to logistics and combat enablers.
Man, we wrestled with this a lot when we stood up. We made the 6 priorities and ultimately established the cross-functional teams. But what we recognized was that you needed representation on the cross-functional logistics a leader that would represent that stakeholder on every one of the teams. And General Perna handpicked these individuals, put them on these teams, because when you're developing these new weapon systems, it may require different enablers. So being on the front end of the process for most of the 31 signature systems, we thought it's best to have the individuals being represented He has a hands-on approach, obviously, in all things that he does. But one of the things in particular we're looking at is just how we, in the modernization enterprise, having a very senior configuration steering board, representation at the 3-star level of the Futures and Concepts Director, Eric Wesley, Combat Development General Richardson, and Paul Ostrowski and ASOL, Daly, the deputy at AMCC.
Due to
Have all the
time,
stakeholders there.
Can I interrupt you? So who is on that team that's addressing the engineer issues and with logistics and enablers?
General Ed Daly is the 3-star, the deputy commander. So at that 3-star level, there's about 6 individuals that are key with driving all of these changes across the modernization continuum.
General, can you expound on what programs you're doing to fill these gaps?
Well, the programs that we're looking at right now is, we do have some, as we did the analysis and we did simulation really at Fort Leavenworth, we came back and we did a comprehensive study on how we're going to fight in the future, and there are gaps as far as in bridges and engineering equipment. We know what they are, and we've got to get them into the budget and the program based with the resources that we have.
I'd like to visit with you later more about some of those specifics. Obviously, Fort Leonard Wood, we have the engineering school, and this is very, very important. I'd like to switch to talking about the helicopters. UH-60M this year requested 36. Last year, it was 74, so that's significantly less than we requested last year. Of these 36 requested this year, 13 are for active duty, 23 are for Army National Guard. Which I actually have a guard unit at Whiteman Air Force Base that flies these. So what is the number requested? Why is the number requested significantly lower than the number last year? And how will this impact units that are in the pipeline to receive the UX-60, the Mike models?
And that we will have to take for the record. Unfortunately, General Lady's time has expired, so they'll get back to you later. I can tell he was looking forward to giving you the answer on that one, too. Ms. Horn.
Thank you very much, Secretary McCarthy and General McConville, for being here. I'm going to pick up one of the issues that Congresswoman Houlihan addressed, as I'm sure neither of you surprised, that housing is a major issue for me and across our nation. And I want to talk about that because I'm incredibly concerned still about the challenges that we are facing with privatized military housing. Despite the fact that last week the Secretary, Defense Secretary Esper, they signed an agreement about the implementing the Tenants' Bill of Rights. 3 of the major provisions were not implemented. We'll continue to follow up on that. And the progress has been insufficient, to say the least. But while the overall request in FY21 budget was a substantial increase across our service branches, the FY2021 budget request for housing in the Army was actually decreased by 11%, and supporting and addressing the privatized housing and fixing the systemic and significant problems there was a 22% decrease. So, Secretary, I'm confused as to why, facing these significant challenges and, again, increase in the need for force structure, how we're going to address the ongoing challenges realistically and take care of our service members and their families with a 22% decrease.
Yes, ma'am. With respect to the Bill of Rights that you mentioned, 3 of the tenants weren't agreed to at this point because there's much work to do. And to your point, we're trying to earn back the trust of our families. So that's why the 15 of the 18 will be implemented by May 1st. There may be some authorities we might need from the committees of jurisdiction in order to get a dispute resolution process in place to work on those maintenance history records. With respect to the management, it has gotten better, but we have a long way to go, to your point.
Yep. Specifically, I want to know about why there was a decrease in the requested funding.
So on the profile, it's so much of it is about execution as it is on the investment decision of which homes do we recapitalize or ultimately knock down.
Okay, and I'll follow up about the authorities needed, because the 3 that were not implemented caused me great concern. We've had a lot of bipartisan support on addressing this issue. The ability to access maintenance history seems pretty basic to me, as well as some of the others that were at the heart of the Tenants' Bill of Rights we passed. So we need to make sure that we're giving the authorities that are needed and holding these companies accountable. But I want to go ahead and switch gears now so we can cover a couple of other things. And I'll ask both of you this next question. So as you know, Fort Sill in Oklahoma, Fort Sill base is a critically important installation to the Army and to Oklahoma. And the Fire Center of Excellence there is doing an amazing job of training the next generation of artillery soldiers to face near-peer adversaries. And looking at the investment of some of our near-peer adversaries, specifically China and its investment in long-range precision strike capabilities, I'd like, Secretary McCarthy, I'll start with you, to talk about, I'm hearing concerns from them and other places about our ability to keep up in our investment. So strategic priorities and timetables to modernize and update the long-range precision fires program.
Yes, ma'am. We have over $10 billion invested across the fit-up and long-range precision fires, extended-range cannon artillery. We are on track to having the 4 batteries by FY23. The fielded. We'll have on the precision strike missile. We're going to have batteries fielded by end of FY22. The hypersonics will have us for strategic capability fielded. Deployable capability by first quarter 23. So we have billions of dollars invested against this and a tremendous amount of energy from senior leadership.
General McConville.
Yes, Congressman, I'd say for both fires and air defense, we are ramping them up because of the change in the fight we see. You know, when you're in a irregular warfare, counterterrorism, we weren't shooting large amounts of artillery. We certainly weren't shooting in a long ways because of potential collateral damage. But the way you deter near-peer competitors is with things like artillery and tanks, and so we are very aggressively investing in that. And what our potential competitors have is they've set up an anti-access area denial capability that's going to be required to be penetrated, and that's why we need these long-range precision fires. And like I said in my statement earlier, we don't want to be outgunned or outranged in the future, so that's why we're investing in artillery.
Thank you very much, and I'll be following up about the housing issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'm one of those that's concerned about the term near peer being used as not necessarily an excuse, but a reason to get rid of systems that are effective and efficient that we use in combat today before a replacement system has proven themselves to be both effective and efficient. And General, I think you used the term that you like to drive it or fly it before we buy it. And sometimes the thing that'll work and is proven that'll work is the thing we ought to stick with, especially until something has proven that it can do it better. The Air Force has proposed to stand down a significant number of A-10s. I am concerned about the close air support mission. I'm also concerned about the command and control aspect of combat for the Army, and specifically I want to talk about ABMS right now. It is an Air Force system. It is JSTARS is your targeting system that the Army is dependent on, that's operated by the Air Force. It operates out of Robins Air Force Base. The Air Force made a decision that I very much disagree with, not to go forward with the recapitalization of the new JSTARS in favor of ABMS. General Wesley from the Futures and Concept Center stated that the ABMS system cannot be the sole solution for the Army's multi-domain operation, command, and control. I was a little taken back with these comments. I would have assumed that if it was going to be the command and control platform for the Army, that the Army would have been involved from the start with the development of the ABMS system. That's apparently not the case. But what is the Army doing with regard to the warfighter multi-domain operational command and control requirements with regard to the Air Force and ABMS moving forward? And have you integrated people from Army Futures and Concept Center with the Air Force to develop the ABMS platform and make sure that it works for the Army?
Yes, Congress. What we're doing is at the overarching concept, we have what we call multi-domain operations, but at the joint level, there's going to be a joint all-domain operations. That's a joint warfighting concept that's being put together by the Joint Force. The joint all-domain command and control is the network that allow us to talk to all the services and link sensors to shooters. The Air Force has the lead on that. Their contribution is, as you said, it's the Air Battle Management System. They're taking a look at that. Our contribution to JADC2 is an integrated battle command system that ties all our sensors to shooters. It's integrated tactical network. It's a cloud, and it's data standardization. And what we're trying to do is bring these systems together so that every sensor, every shooter from every service in the battlefield can communicate as we move in the future.
General, it's one of those things that's much easier said than done, if I'm not.
No, you're absolutely correct. This is hard stuff. I mean, it briefs a lot better in PowerPoint.
If many of your aircraft, in fact, probably all of our aircraft still operate on VHF. Is that?
Well, not all, but we have VHF, UHF, Foxmite, and satellite communications. So most of them have multiple communications capabilities, so they can talk if something happens.
Point being that a soldier miking up and talking to another soldier.
Sure.
Is probably the same system we're going to use many years from now, I would think. I'm down to a minute, but Mr. Secretary, the coordination among the branches and the leadership of the branches is a very serious concern of mine, and I know over the the duration of our secretaries is on average 24 months or so, and so I'm glad you're there. I wish you good luck, especially in the Army-Navy game. But I hope that you will stay on the Secretary of the Air Force about making sure that as they stand down systems that the soldier on the ground in the Army depends on, that that they have another system that's ready to go before they stand down the system, that systems that are efficient and effective, then that our soldiers depend on a daily basis.
We had this very discussion last week, sir, on the defense planning guidance, where we had senior leaders from all the services meet with DepSecDef and talk about how the architecture, technical architecture for this has to be complementary so that all of the services can then deploy their capability and fight jointly. Yes, sir.
Well, if you take him to Benning, I'm going to tag along with you.
It's a short ride for you, sir, I know.
Thank you. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I was recently informed that 2 Army medical research labs, the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick and the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Chemical Defense at Aberdeen Proving Ground, are currently going through funding issues, including a hold on reimbursements in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. These labs provide critical support, developing countermeasures and treatments to both chemical weapons and infectious disease, including the coronavirus. They played an instrumental role in the vaccine for anthrax, smallpox, and Ebola. The coronavirus is having an impact on readiness. General McConville, you mentioned canceled joint exercises in South Korea. We also know that there is restricted access to public areas for service members in Italy. There's the offshore quarantine, basically, of all ships that have made port in the Pacific. CENTCOM has ordered all military personnel in Saudi Arabia to stop non-essential travel. We have canceled joint military exercises in Israel, and at least 1 service member and their spouse in South Korea has been tested positive for coronavirus. It is having an impact on readiness. General Milley says that the DOD is working feverishly on a coronavirus vaccine, but I've got concerns. And Secretary McCarthy, you mentioned we've got a crackerjack scientist who's on the case. 1 person cannot do the job. The lab at Fort Detrick has some serious funding issues. It is a lab that operates on a reimbursement model. So when customer demand is down, they don't have the revenues to invest in human capital, the scientists that they need, or in modernizing their equipment. I don't think it's a sustainable model. So the question for the panel, how do we ensure that these critical labs both have stable funding to maintain capability and that they can surge to meet crises like coronavirus?
Yes, sir. I highlighted earlier the extraordinary technical talent that exists, to your point, and those were just the leaders of those efforts. There's some amazing individuals that work alongside them. What was going on over the last year was that the Army senior leadership recognized that the overhead rates for the labs were growing double-digit cost year over year. So what I'm referring to there is the overhead administrative management and base operations. And it started trending in the 60s, and then it was north of 74% last year. So we recognized we needed stronger leadership to go in there to reduce the overhead cost so you could put more dollars into the hands of the researchers. It was a management issue. To your point, it was also a business model challenge. So from that standpoint, what General Murray is doing is looking at what they call a rate board, so you can stabilize the rates. So when CDC or NIH or other government entities turn and say, we need this world-class talent, here's that cost. It's a similar challenge that we face with our industrial base with the revenue that has to go in to the depots. And you want it to be consistent, but still have surge capacity when you have extraordinary instances like the coronavirus. A lot of work, a lot of really good work has been done, but we still have a little work to go to get to the end of this fiscal year.
And one of the things that I would suggest, and I did speak with General Murray, and they do have a lot of work to do to improve the efficiency of that lab, is to seriously consider a core budget in addition to the reimbursable model. Reimbursable models work well, but when demand is down, you have difficulty maintaining scientists and keeping equipment at the modern levels that they need. So I would hope that we're looking at a core budget. If I could just quickly shift to Africa, I'm pleased that we're sending a Security Force Assistant Brigade there. There's the tyranny of distance. There's also less fortified bases in which to operate, unlike in Afghanistan. And this was all pointed out by Brigadier General Jackson. He's excited to go, but there are some challenges. Could you please reassure this committee that they'll have the infrastructure, the logistics, the things that they need to do to get the job done?
Yes, sir.
We'll make sure they have what they need to get the job done, Congressman.
Thank you. Ms. Cheney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary and General McConville, thank you for your service. Thank you very much for being here. I want to ask about Afghanistan. All of us, I think, I know, on both sides of the aisle, understand the need to make sure that we on the Hill are operating in ways that are worthy of the sacrifice of our men and women who put on the uniform. We have, a number of us, serious concerns about the Afghanistan agreement as it was released, including the extent to which we are making a number of concessions, the release, committing to the release by the Afghan government of thousands of Taliban fighters, committing to help to work to lift sanctions on terrorists, committing to withdraw our forces. And I was pleased to hear over the weekend Secretary Pompeo make a number of assertions that would have given me comfort, a number of assertions about what we would find when we saw the full agreement and the full documents as they came to the Hill. He made assertions including that there were complex interlocking verification mechanisms. He asserted that there would be a full and complete renunciation of al-Qaeda by the Taliban. I've read the documents, and my concerns remain. I'm not going to talk about what's in the documents. A number of them are classified, as you know, but the documents that have been sent to the Hill do not include those things. So my question, first of all, to you, Secretary McCarthy, is, are there documents that have not been sent to the Hill?
I'm not aware because I'm not directly involved with that.
I'm sorry, I think I can help with that because we've asked about that. My understanding is, and my staff can correct me on this, is just today all of the documents have been sent and will be available in some skiff today. That's my understanding.
And I've read those. I read them before the hearing, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
So
You're right. Yeah, there were a number of documents that were made available that I went to read in the skiff before coming here this morning. And those documents do not include in them the things that Secretary Pompeo said they would. So my concerns still remain. The decisions about U.S. troop levels on the ground in Afghanistan we have been assured, the American people have been assured, would always be based upon the national security interests, the counterterrorism threat that we face. And when we're in a situation, as we seem to be now, where we have no verification agreement and we have a number of secret documents, I'd like to ask a couple of things. Number one, and I understand Secretary Pompeo said those documents could not be released to the American people because they would affect troop security. The documents have been seen by the Taliban. So I believe that the American people deserve to know what agreement has been entered into in our name with the terrorists who harbored those who killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11. And I would like the assurances, both of your assurances, that the documents, if either that all of the documents have been delivered, in which case there is not a verification agreement, in which case we do not have the kind of full, complete renunciation of al-Qaeda that Secretary Pompeo says we do. So I'd like your assurance that you will come back to the committee and let us know, is it the case that the documents have all been delivered, in which case those things do not exist, or are there additional documents that need to be delivered to the Hill?
Ma'am, we'll definitely address your concerns with Secretary Esper.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then finally, I would just ask for your commitment, both of you, that the decisions about U.S. troop levels on the ground in Afghanistan will be made based on what's necessary for our security. Either we need forces on the ground to conduct counterterrorism and intelligence operations, or we don't. And if we don't, then we ought to bring everybody home right now, and we ought not deploy a single additional U.S. service member. But if we do, then we have a moral obligation not to pretend the Taliban can take care of that security concern, that security threat for us. And I think that what we have seen with this agreement now concerns me as much as the Iranian nuclear deal did. Now that I have seen the documents, and now that there seems to be still no verification mechanism by which we are going to enforce any of the so-called Taliban promises. So I would appreciate any response that you all have to that. Again, I appreciate your service. I think it's very important that the American people know what's been agreed to on our behalf.
Yes, ma'am, with conditions-based withdrawal is necessary.
Thank you. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary General, thank you for being here. A lot has been covered that I was going to address, so I want to just sort of drill down to a couple of things I have more personal involvement in. Number one of my other assignments here is chair of the subcommittee on Europe and Eurasia on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I want to underscore, and I know, General, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, the importance and how well received Exercise Defender Europe 20 has been. That is, and to the government leaders of our European allies, I can't tell you how important and how grateful they are for our involvement in that. I wanted to get a sense. I know Germany and UK are very much involved in participating in this, but if you could, General, some of the other neighboring countries in the region, what their involvement might be, and what you foresee, which is really the most important part of my question.
Yeah, Congressman, I had a chance
future.
to go over to Europe as one of my first trips as Chief of Staff, and we do a conference for all the Chiefs of Staffs of the Army at the time, and there was 37 countries there, and I personally met with 34 of those chiefs, and I can tell you that our commitment, our relationships, our the ability to work with their militaries is extremely important. They want U.S. leadership. They want us to participate. And again, this exercise, is one of those important ways of showing our commitment that we can come there if they need us, and it reassures our allies and partners in the region.
Do you see any? What do you see foreseeable in the future about other regional countries participating even more?
Well, I think, again, I talked to 34 out of 37, and not all are NATO members, but all want to partner. They all want to participate. There's other exercises going on that are not necessarily NATO exercises during the same time frame. But I think they all share the same goals and really the same values. That's why I'm surprised. They want to be with us.
It's so well received. I just wanted to communicate, which you already knew, but it's good to underscore it from the political side and the people you talk to, in the parliaments there. Also, looking And another aspect, open skies treaty is on a pause, but for the same kind of reasons. When I talk to General Walters and other people, keeping that cooperation is an important part of that. So do you have any, can you reflect on, the importance? I know that the Russians have violated it, I understand that, but I still think it has an importance for the same type of reasons, keeping our allies together.
Well, I'll defer to General Walters. He's a little closer. He's a friend. He's a very wise person on that issue. And then the Secretary. But my experience, I said this in my opening statement, is great power competition does not have to mean great power conflict. And the way really you avoid conflict is through strength. And when we're united with all our partners, and we're standing strong, and everyone is standing side by side, no one's going to want to take us on. And as far as these agreements, I think it's important that we have discussions with even those that we may not be getting along with the greatest. So there's room, especially if nothing else, military to military.
No, I recall our other times meeting together and
yeah,
your
we need
involvement.
to
So thank
communicate.
you personally for that.
We may not agree on everything, but we should communicate with those. And I know that General Milley routinely does that, even during these very tough issues, and even during some of these other situations going on. We're all communicating with our fellow chiefs.
Quickly, the second thing that's kind of close to home, and close to your home too, of Quincy, a little south of that, about 50 miles, is Joint Base Cape Cod and Camp Edwards, and the training is there. Just a couple of points. In talking to the folks there, they're concerned too about how you balance off maybe some of the environmental issues in the training, that are they noise or land environmental issues, and how that affects training. I'm running out of time, so I'll mention too that the importance too of one of Army's most critical enablers in logistics, transportation, sustainment, is the Army National Guard and U.S. Army Reserve. In the training, the reports show them a little behind, but I see firsthand how that is improving. So if you can sort of address those two issues in 30 seconds.
I know a little about the Massachusetts State Guard. In fact, we hired Rich Johnson out of there, and we brought him down here and made him a 2-star. But I think it's very, very important, especially places like Massachusetts. We don't have a whole lot of military anymore. The people get to see them. When we look about where we recruit, a lot of it is exposure, and it's very, very important that the American people throughout the entire country have that exposure. And sometimes there are challenges with noise and some of those other types of things that go along with military training. But that is sometimes the cost of freedom, so to speak, is we want to be, our soldiers have to train, they have to be ready, because I don't think anyone would want to send our National Guard soldiers off to conflict without being fully trained, because there's some noise issues. So
thank you. My time is up, and thank you again. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for your service to our country and for being here today. Secretary McCarthy, in the fiscal year 2021 budget documents, the Army's requested $1.4 billion for depot maintenance accounts. And my understanding is that will only support 64% of the identified requirements. Given the priority that the military leadership has put on readiness, how is funding only 64% of requirements going to meet that support near-term readiness and sustainment of the Army's organic industrial base?
Yes, sir. It's about a 17.5% increase year over year from FY20. What we're looking for is how do we meet our near-term readiness goals, but still have not over-capacitizing the depots, but have the room to grow in the event of a large-scale ground combat operation. So we've seen challenges with other depots where we flush too much revenue, hire too many people, and then when the revenues change based off of operations, you're over-capacitized. You have people that don't have work. So striking the balance at 64% helps us run smooth operations, grow the workforce, but still have the capacity or room to grow.
A perennial problem that we've had in the depot system has been carryover issues. I asked General Perna a couple of years ago to get me some language that he felt would remedy that, and he did last year, and we put it in the NDAA. Can you tell me, or are you aware as to whether or not that has resolved that problem?
It's greatly enhanced his abilities. He's very encouraged by that. We've shown some improvement.
I have been asking for AMC to report to me on how it's worked. Could you assure me that you'd have AMC reach out to my office and give me some information as to how that language is worked, because if we need to do a little more, we got another NDA coming this year.
We'll see him later this afternoon. We'll definitely bring that up.
I
Yes, sir.
appreciate that. And General McConville, are the Army's training ranges currently capable of providing training to meet the Army's emphasis on multi-domain operations?
They are, Congressman, but there's some things we're going to, as we get to longer range artillery and we start to look at some of the systems and we get to being contested in some of the systems that we're going to see, we're going to have to take a look at our ranges and make sure that they can accommodate that.
Okay. If anything this committee can do to be helpful, be sure and let me know, and we'll try to make it.
Yeah, we'll come back to you, but we are looking at that. We know there's going to be some changes. We just got to make sure we know where they're going to be and what we need to do.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank you both for being here. Let me say to both of you, as subcommittee chair of the Military Personnel Committee, I have been to 12 bases. Every base I've gone to, I've asked to meet with the families. Every meeting I've had has complained about the condition of the housing units. We spent a good part of the NDAA creating this new housing management office within each installation. So what I would like for you to do, maybe this is to you, General, is to report back to the committee on have they all been identified, and if not, why not? And to the extent that they have been identified, how many complaints have been filed and what has been the review of those complaints and what has taken place. I now want to move to another issue dealing with white supremacy. General, a military Times survey in 2019 found that 36% of responding troops had seen evidence of white supremacist and racist ideologies in the military. This comes as violent white supremacist incidents increase across our country. It is indeed alarming to read that statistic. I want to know what you're doing to make sure that we identify those who associate themselves with white supremacists and what we're doing to process them out of the military.
Well, Congressman, first of all, there's no place for extremism in our military of any type, and we have a CID task force, so to speak, that takes a look at those type of extremist type cases, and they are working very, very closely with the FBI to make sure that we can identify those who may be involved in those type of incidents. Then we're taking the appropriate legal actions to make sure that that does not occur. Okay, General, would you report back to the committee about the number of incidents within the Army and what steps have been taken? Sure. Secretary McCarthy, last June, an Army Appeals Court panel overturned the conviction of a West Point cadet named Jacob Weisenhunt. A jury of officers had heard his trial, found him guilty of 3 counts of sexual assault, and convicted him to 21 years of confinement. Yet, 3 judges who were not present for the trial reviewed the case and decided for themselves that Weisenhunt wasn't guilty, setting him free. They undid months of preparation, days of trial, and justice for a survivor in a mere 3.5-page opinion. The panel concluded that though Weisenhunt and his victim had sex, it had to be consensual because, quote, in the unique circumstances here, which included a noise-producing space blanket and numerous squad mates in very close proximity, it's hard to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that appellant could complete the charged offenses without cooperation or detection. No U.S. jurisdiction besides the military gives appeals courts the power to overturn cases based on their rereading of the facts. When this power leads to embarrassing miscarriages of justice, why does the military system need to keep factual sufficiency in place on the appellate level?
Congresswoman, I would have to defer to the legal counsel. I mean, this is outside of my particular expertise, but I would definitely want to look at this and come back to the committee.
All right. This whole issue of factual sufficiency existed before we had a military that had professional judges and free and qualified representation through the appellate level. So it's really antiquated. It does miscarriages of justice, in my opinion, so I would appreciate that. Secretary McCarthy, contraception is critical for military readiness. and for treatment of health conditions like endometriosis. According to the DoD, 95% of all women serving are of childbearing age. Under TRICARE, there's no cost sharing for active duty, but there is cost sharing for non-active duty service members and family dependents to pay co-pays for birth control. Now, some birth control can run as much as $1,000 for an IUD. Under the Affordable Care Act, everyone has access to all forms of contraception without cost. So why is it we are imposing a cost sharing on those service members and families? Shouldn't they deserve the same level of coverage as every other childbearing age woman in this country?
Congresswoman, that obviously seems reasonable. I'll get with the staff and get back to you on that as well.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Secretary McCarthy, General McConville for prioritizing personnel and your efforts there, as well as readiness and modernization. General McConville, I want to go to you. I have a series of 6 questions. Most of them are pretty short, straightforward, and I want to end with one that requires a little more elaboration. If conflict broke out today in the Indo-Pacific region, would it be necessary for the Army to get there?
Yes, Congressman.
All right, great. If conflict were to break out today in the Indo-Pacific, could the Army get there?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, so you could get everything that's necessary to get there now as we speak?
We believe so.
Okay.
I always like to say the proof's in the execution. That's why we're doing exercises like Defend the 20, though. I want to see it. I want to be able to move it and come back to you and say those ships that we said were ready to go, those planes that are ready to go, they actually are, and they work.
But based on your knowledge of all the O plans, do you think it should be a top priority of the Army to be able to get to the Indo-Pacific in case of a conflict? Question one. And the second one is either an affirmation or a question to me, is based upon all that you're doing to raise the readiness of your units. You can have the best brigade combat teams in the world, the best striker brigades, but if we've got something that happens outside of CONUS, they can be great, but we got to get them there. So would you agree with that assertion that the key really is not just the training, but being able to get them there and looking at the importance?
I agree with that, Congressman. I think, as you read the National Defense Strategy, dynamic force employment is one of the key tenets of the ability, and that's why the Secretary and I have made strategic readiness, the ability to get there, is one of our key priorities.
Do you think that surge sea-lift recapitalization is something that transcends service branches, so it's not parochial in how we should look at it as a force?
Well, I think the Department of Defense should look at how we're going to get a top line. We're going to figure out who does what within the top line, and whoever gets that task to do it should be resourced appropriately to make that happen.
As you look at those elements that are of high strategic importance to the United States, we look at B-21, ground-based strategic deterrence, the Columbia-class submarine. I would argue as part of that, surge sea-lift is another element of strategic importance that transcends service branches. Is it fair to say that as we look at the different service branches, Air Force funding B-21 with Navy funding Columbia against strategic assets, that we should look less parochially at surge sea-lift, or do you think that it should be something that falls under the Army's wherewithal on funding, because about 90% of what the Army needs to get to the fight is going to be done by surge sea-lift?
Yeah, I think when it comes to resources, about who pays for it, you got to take a look at the prioritization. As Secretary said, we're pretty much flatlined in the Army. We're basically going to zero growth to keep that, and we're very highly deployed, and we need to modernize the Army for the future. So a decision would have to take that into consideration of who would actually fund that without an increase in top line.
Sure. If you look historically about how many of these missions have been funded in the past, we have a national fund that goes in, a National Strategic Deterrence Fund, where money has gone in to be able to do things that are of issue across service branches, and whether it's aircraft or whether it's ships, we have done those things. So in looking at things historically, and that we do have a National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund that could include surge sea-lift, would you think it a wise investigation to look at using that particular fund to put the dollars in necessary for surge sea lift?
Well, what I would do is I think, at least from the Army, we need sea lift to get our forces to the fight, and I would defer to those that are making the budget decisions about the best place to put those funds.
But you would be straightforward in saying that where we are today and what the Army would face in the future, that there is a delta there that we have to bridge as far as modernization and capacity within sea lift?
Well, I think so. I know there's been studies done. I think they said we require 9.2 million square feet of capability to go ahead and move our forces. You know, the word is it's good today, but as we look in the future, we're going to have to invest, and there's three different ways of doing that: extending the life of the ships we have, buying used ships, or actually building new ships, and it's probably some combination of the both. But I think we need to really take a hard look at that, how we deal with that in the future.
Just to put it in context, the requirement is to meet 85% of the need, and the most recent turbo activation took place September 17th. We only met about 40% of the demand. So while the Army may have the desire to get there, the desire versus the capability, the delta, I think, is pretty significant. So anyway, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, and I believe that concludes our hearing. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your service and for your testimony. We look forward to working with you as we get our bill done this year and get the appropriations bills done as well. Thank you for a very informative hearing, and we are adjourned.
Thanks.